In this tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural mossy dirt material in Blender. And then after we create the procedural material, I'm going to show you how to join it together into this custom node with all of these different sliders. Now I'm using the adaptive subdivision on the object because it makes the material much more detailed, but it does make the render preview a little bit slow. So what I'm going to do is just hide it for now by clicking on the monitor icon here next to the subdivision modifier. So we're going to be creating these different custom values like the scale, so you can change the entire scale of the material. You can also just change the moss scale and also just change the dirt scale. Then we have the dirt color, so you can make the dirt maybe a little bit more yellowy or a little bit more brown or red. And then also the moss color, so you could make the moss brighter or darker, or you could make it more of like a dried out yellowish moss. Then there's also the moss amount, so if you want very little moss or lots of moss, you can change that. And then there's also a roughness value as well to change the roughness of the material. And then there's also the moss bump strength and the dirt bump strength. And then lastly here, the displacement strength. If you'd like to help support the channel and purchase this material, you can get that on my Gumroad store in my Patreon page, links in the description. You can also check out my procedural material packs to purchase more of my materials, and you can also check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist to learn how to create any of my procedural materials. So real quick, I'm going to show you how I set up the 3D viewport if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So I pressed Shift A, I went here to Mesh, and I added an icosphere, and then right behind me on the Add Icosphere settings, if you open that up, I'm going to turn the subdivisions up to 6 so that it is a nice smooth subdivided sphere. And I do want it to have lots of geometry because we're going to be using the displacements in the node editor to make the geometry actually pop out and give it more detail. Now I do want this object to be closer to the real life scale in Blender, and the default objects are a little higher than an average human. So I'm going to scale this object by 0.2 and then enter. So it is a bit smaller. And then I'll just press Ctrl A and I'm going to apply the scale. So this is the object's default scale. And then I can just shade the object smooth. Then I also added a camera and I just pointed the camera at the icosphere. Now for the lighting, I added these 4 different lights. So the first light here is just this area light, and this area light is just kind of shining on the side of the sphere to give it some bright lighting on the front. And then I also added in 3 other lights. So I added this light here, and this light here, and this light here. And these lights are all area lights as well. And I turned the shape to rectangle and then just turned up the size. And that way they'll work better as rim lights because I put these lights kind of on the side to give a nice rim light on the edge of the sphere. And for all of these lights, I set the color to a very slightly yellow color, and I turned the power to 70. And then also to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections, I also added in this HDRI from polyhaven.com, and honestly, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, but I'll have a link in the description if you'd like to download this HDRI, and I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So to add in the HDRI, you can add a new world in the world panel, and then you can click here on color, click on the yellow dot, and you can choose environment texture, and then just click on open and open up the HDRI. And then if you want to make the background transparent so you can't see the HDRI in the background, then you can go right up here to the render properties, and you can open up the film tab and then just check mark the transparent button so that you can't see the HDRI in the background. And then also to make the colors more contrasty and saturated, if you go here to the color management, you can use the view transform of filmic, and then on the look here you can change this to very high contrast. Now I'm also going to be using the adaptive displacements to give this material much more detail. So if you want to use the adaptive displacements, then you will need to be using the Cycles rendering engine, and also you'll need to turn the feature set here to experimental. So with the object selected, you can go over to the modifier properties and you can click on add modifier, and you can add the subdivision surface modifier. So the subdivision surface modifier will subdivide the mesh and give it more geometry that the displacements can use. And then also I checked the adaptive subdivision, and so this is going to give more detail where the camera is closer to the object. And then I just set the dicing scale to 10. So I'm in the shading workspace, so I have the 3D viewport right here and I'm in the rendered mode, and then I also have the shader editor right here. So let's click on new to add a new material, and I can rename the material. And the adaptive subdivision makes the material much more detailed, but it does slow down the viewport a bit. So I'm actually going to click on this button right here just to hide the modifier in the viewport, but it'll still show up in the render. And then we can also rename the material, so I'm going to rename it to Mossy Dirt. Now there is one more really important setting to get the displacements to work. So once you add the new material, you can click right here on the material properties and you can scroll down here. And then under the settings, under surface, we want to turn the displacement from bump only to displacement and bump. And this way we're telling the material that it can use the displacements. And then before we create the procedural material, I'm going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click here on edit and you can go to the preferences, and then over there on the add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler and you can check mark the Node Wrangler add-on. So to create this material, I'm going to be creating two different shaders, a dirt shader and a moss shader, and then we're going to join the shaders together. So let's first create the moss shader. So the first thing that I want to do here on the principled shader is create a base color for the moss. So I'm going to click here on the base color and I'm just going to make it kind of like a dark green. And actually, I think it would look nicer if it was slightly towards the yellow. I think it looks pretty cool if it's a little bit towards the yellow because it makes the moss look a little bit dried out. Or if you want the moss to look more fresh, you could make it kind of a deeper, more saturated green color. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using, you can go over to the hex value and you can punch in 222F11. Now I also want to make the moss much more rough, so let's take the roughness value here and I'm just going to turn that up to like a 0.8 so it is more rough. And then I also want a little bit of light to be going through the moss just to make it look a bit more organic. So I'm going to turn up the subsurf. So when we turn up the subsurface scattering, it's going to allow light to go through the material. Now I do want the subsurface scattering to be very subtle. So here on the subsurface, I'm going to turn this to a 0.001, just a 0.001. And then here on the subsurface color, this is going to be the color of the subdivision surface when the light shines through the material. So I don't want it to be white. I want to make it a very dark green because it is moss. So I'm going to make it green and very dark. And the hex value that I'll be using for the subsurface color is going to be 1A220D. Now I want to give a texture to this moss because right now it is very smooth. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the noise texture. And let's put the noise texture down here. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture. And when you hold down the Control and Shift key and then select different nodes, that's using the feature the Node Wrangler, and it's going to preview the node on the object. And also with the noise texture selected, I'm going to press Ctrl T. That is again using another feature of the Node Wrangler, and it's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping. And the texture coordinate and mapping tells the texture how it's going to be placed on the object. And then I want to use the object coordinates, so let's put the object to the vector, and this way it'll place the texture on the object very evenly. So if you Control Shift and select the noise texture, I want to Control Shift and select it so that we can preview the factor. And then I want to change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale up to like a 20, and then I also want it to be much more detailed, so let's turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then I want to give it even more detail, so I can turn the roughness up, and I'm going to turn the roughness up to like a 0.9. So now it is very, very detailed. So I now want to put this noise texture into the normal to give it some bump. So let's take the factor and I can put that into the normal. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. But you can see there's some really weird shading issues and it's not working correctly. And that is because this is black and white data, but then this here is normal data. So we need a node to convert the black and white data into normal data that the shader can use. So let's press Shift A. I can go to the search and I can search for the bump node. And I want to drop the bump node here in the wire between the noise texture and the principled shader. And then the factor can go into the height value, and this way it'll convert it to normal data. So you can now see the moss looks all bumpy. Now I want to make the moss a bit more contrasty because I don't want it to be super even all over the place. I want some parts to be a bit more bumpy and other parts to be less bumpy. So I'm going to click and drag just to box select these nodes, and I'm going to bring them back. And then I'll also bring the noise texture back, and I want to add a color ramp after the noise texture, and we can use the color ramp to make the noise texture more contrasty. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp here between the noise texture and the bump. And you can also Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. So now if I drag the white and black tabs together, if they are closer together, it's going to be more contrasty. So I'm going to drag these two tabs to about there and there. So if I Control Shift and select the principled shader, you can see some parts are really bumpy, but then other parts are more smooth. Now I do want to add just a tiny little bit of bump all over the material. So what I'm going to do is actually duplicate this bump, and then we're just going to add the original noise texture. So with this bump node selected, I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate, and then let's put it after the first one. Now the normal can go through the normal because it's already converted the first one to normal data. So this way we can add multiple bump maps together. So we now have this extra height value that we can add data into because we've added another bump. So I can now just take the noise texture and we can take the factor and I can just put that into the height. So now we are mixing two bump maps together. And then I do want to make it more subtle. So on the second bump here, let's turn the strength way down to just like a 0.1 so it's very subtle. And that's actually a bit too subtle, so I'm going to turn it up to like a 0.3 so you can see it a bit better. And that is what I want. And that is it for the procedural moss material. So it's actually really simple. I'm going to click and drag to select the texture coordinate and mapping, and I'm going to bring them back down here because we're going to be using the texture coordinate and mapping to control all the textures. And that way we can use these scale values to scale the entire material. So all of these nodes here, this is the procedural moss. So just to organize this really well so that we don't get confused, I'm going to join these together in a frame. So I'm going to click and drag to box select all these nodes, just select all the nodes here, and then you can press Ctrl J. Ctrl J is going to join them together into a frame, and I can also bring them together to kind of compact them a little bit better. And then if you click on the frame and make sure it's selected, you can press F2 and that will add a label, and I'm just going to rename this to moss. So that is the moss shader, but we still need to create a dirt shader and then we need to join them together. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for another principled shader, and let's stick the principled shader down here. So this one is going to be the procedural dirt. So I'm going to Control Shift and select this shader to preview it. So to make the dirt texture, I'm going to start by adding a noise texture to make it noisy. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and let's put the noise texture down here. And then I also want to use the same texture coordinate and mapping, so let's take the mapping vector and I can put that into the vector of the noise texture. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And we can change some of the settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to like a 20 so that you can see more of it. And then I also want to turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then I also want to turn the roughness up just a little bit, so I'll turn the roughness up to like a 0.55 so it just has a little bit more roughness. And then I think adding some distortion would be really nice, so I'm going to turn the distortion just to 0.2 because I don't want it to be too strong, but just adding a little bit of distortion can make it look a bit nicer. Now this noise texture is just kind of basic. It is just a very basic noise texture, and I want to make it look a bit more interesting and make it look like dirt. So I'm going to be adding another node in here between the mapping and the noise texture to distort the placement of the noise. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the Musgrave texture, and we're going to put the Musgrave texture in between the mapping and the noise texture. So the Musgrave texture is going through the vector, and the vector is used to control the placement of the texture. And so the Musgrave is distorting the placement of the noise texture. And then let's also change some of the Musgrave settings. So right here on the type, I'm going to click on this and I'm going to change it to the multifractal. I'll leave the scale at 5, but I do want it to be very detailed, so you can turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then here on the dimension, if you turn the dimension down, you can see it's going to be much more detailed. So I'm going to turn the dimension just to like a 0.8. Now if you zoom in here, that does look pretty cool. It is a very cool texture and it is really detailed, but it doesn't really look like dirt. So I want the Musgrave texture to have less control over the distortion of the noise. So I basically want the Musgrave texture to distort the noise less. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the mix node, and let's drop the mix node right up here. And then I'm going to click on the float here, and I instead want to change this to color. And then I can drop the mix in between the Musgrave and the noise. So with this mix, I'm going to mix the original mapping and the Musgrave texture. So I'm going to put the Musgrave texture into color B, and then this original mapping, the vector is going to go into color A. So now if I turn the factor all the way to 0, it's not using the Musgrave at all, so it's not being distorted at all, it just looks like the noise. But as I turn the factor up more and more, it's going to be distorting it more and more because it's using more of the Musgrave texture. Now you can see when I drag this around, it's moving the texture around a lot. So to make it so the texture isn't being moved around, you can click on the mix here, and you can change the type to linear light. So I can now drag the factor and it's not moving around quite as much. Now I do want this to be pretty subtle, so I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.03. So now it is distorting it. You can see it is distorted just a little bit, but it makes it look much more interesting. It still looks noisy, but it is more distorted. So I can now take this noise texture and I want to put it into the normal to give the dirt some bump. So I can take the factor and let's stick that into the normal. And then just like we did right up here with the moss, we need to convert the black and white data into normal data that the shader can use. So I'm going to Control Shift and select the principled shader, and then I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the bump node, and let's put the bump node in between the noise texture and the normal. And then we want the factor to be going into the height value, and that way it'll convert it to normal data. And then it's really bright, so to see it better, I'm just going to take the base color and I'm going to turn it down, and just for now I'm going to make it like a brown color so it looks more like dirt. And now you can see that is all bumpy. Now it is a bit too strong, so I'm going to take the strength here and I'm just going to turn that to like a 0.3 so it is less strong. And then it is kind of shiny. Right now it looks kind of like a wet dirt or maybe like mud, but I want to make it more rough. So I'm going to take the roughness here on the principled shader and I'll just turn this up. I think like a value of 0.8 looks pretty good. So now the dirt is much more rough and it looks more dry. Now I want the dirt material to have different shades of brown. So I can take the noise texture and I can take the factor and I'm going to put that into the base color. And so this way it'll use that texture, so some parts will be lighter or darker. But I don't want to use white and black. I want to use some different colors. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I can search for the mix. And let's put the mix right up here. And then I want to click on the float here, and I want to change this to color because we are working with color values. And then I can drop the mix in between the noise and the principled. And then I actually want the noise texture. I want that to be going into the factor because the factor is controlling where it's going to be A and where it's going to be B. So for color A, I'm going to make this brown, and then I'm going to make it very, very dark. And then for B, I'm going to make this a dark brown, but not quite as dark. And if you want to use the same exact hex values that I'm using, on color A, this is going to be a hex value of 0D, 08, 05. And then here on B, you can punch in a hex value of 33, 1F, 14, if you want to use the same colors that I'm using. Now there is a little bit of variation in the color, but it is very faded. And so I want to make the noise texture more contrasty, and then it will be more clear where it's A and where it's B. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the color ramp, and let's put the color ramp in between the noise and the mix. So if I Control Shift and select the color ramp, I can drag the two values together, and if I drag the values together, they're going to be much more contrasty. And if I Control Shift and select the mix, you can see the black values of the color ramp are going to be color A, and then the white parts of the color ramp are going to be color B. So I'm going to Control Shift and select the principled shader, and then I can just kind of drag this around and get it to something that I like. So that's a little bit too contrasty, so I'm going to drag the black tab to about here, and then I'll drag the white tab over to about there. And that is it for the procedural dirt material. So I'm just going to click and drag to box select all these nodes here, and then I can press Ctrl J, that will join them together into a frame, and you don't have to add them into a frame, but just to keep them very nicely organized, I am going to put them into a frame. And you can also compress the nodes down, so just kind of bring them together so that they're nicely organized. And then if you click on the frame, you can press F2 to add a label, and I'm just going to rename this to dirt. So now I can Control Shift and select between the two different shaders, and we have the moss and the dirt. So I now want to join them together. So I'm going to bring the material output down here into the middle, and then I'm going to select the first shader, and then hold down the Shift key and select the second shader. Now to join them together, I can press Control 0, and Control 0 is using a feature of the Node Wrangler, and it's going to add a mix shader, and it's going to join them together. So you can see the moss is going into the top one, and the dirt is going into the bottom one. Now right here on the mix shader, there's a factor, and just like the mix nodes right here, the factor is going to control where it's the first shader and where it's the second. So right now we're just kind of evenly blending between them, so they're kind of fading. So I can turn the factor down to 0, and now it's just using the moss, or I can turn the factor up to 1 and it's just using the dirt. Now I want to add a texture into the factor so that some parts have lots of moss and then other parts have lots of dirt. So we can actually use a texture that we've already added. So this noise texture will work really great. So I'm going to take the factor from this noise texture in the moss, and I'm going to bring this over and stick this into the factor of the mix shader. So now the noise texture is controlling where it's going to be the moss and the dirt. Now you can see it really didn't do much, and that is because it's not very contrasty. So just like we did here with the color ramp, we're going to make it more contrasty, and then it will be more clear where it's each shader. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for a color ramp, and I'm going to put the color ramp here in the wire before it goes into the mix shader factor. And I can just bring this here into the middle. So I can now drag these two tabs together, and now it's going to be much more contrasty. And I actually want to drag them really close together so that it's very clear where it's the dirt and where it's the moss. So I'm going to drag them really close. And I actually want to flip the values because I want there to be mostly dirt, but you can really drag these to wherever you want. So if you want there to be lots of moss, you can drag these over here, and now you can see it's mostly moss. Or if you want to be mostly dirt, you can drag this over here. I'm going to have this kind of about in the middle, but I do want to have a little bit more dirt. Now we still haven't added the displacement, and the displacement is really going to make it look much more like dirt, and it's going to add tons more detail because right now the material does look pretty flat. Now because this material is primarily dirt, I'm going to use this noise texture from the dirt, and I'm going to put that into the displacement. So let's take the noise texture factor, and I can drag this over, and I can stick it into the displacement of the material output. Now when I do that, you can see there's some weird issues here. It's like jutting off to the side. Now if the displacement isn't working for you, you might want to go back and just make sure that you've turned on all the displacement settings, which I go over at the beginning of this video. But one thing to make sure of is that this material is using the displacements in the settings. So if you select the material, you can go over here to the material properties, and then I'm going to scroll down, and here under settings, under surface, you need to make sure that the displacement is either set to displacement only or displacement and bump. I'm going to use displacement and bump. Now we don't want it to be jutting off to the side like this, and why that's happening is because we haven't converted the black and white data into displacement data. So to convert it to displacement data, I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the displacement node. And let's drop the displacement node here in between the noise texture and the displacement. And I'll just stick it right here underneath the mix shader. And then we actually want to put the wire into the height value, and that way it'll convert it to displacement data. So now you can see it's working properly, although it is way too strong. So I'm going to turn the scale way down here, so you can just drag the scale value down to make it much more subtle. And I am going to use a scale value of 0.02. I think 0.02 looks pretty good. And then also to be able to see this in its full detail, I'm going to go right over here to the modifier properties, and I disabled the subdivision surface modifier. So I'm just going to click right here to show the subdivision surface modifier so we can see it with all the detail. So that is looking really cool. So we now have some really detailed dirt. So I'm now going to show you how to join this material together into a custom node. So just for now, I will hide the subdivision from the viewport just so that the viewport is faster. So to join this together into a node group, I'm going to zoom out, and then I'm going to click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output. And I can press Ctrl G, and Ctrl G will join them together into a node group. And you can press the tab key to go in and out of the node group. And then if I zoom in here, I'm going to make this bigger, and then I can also rename the material. So I'm going to click on the name here, press Ctrl C to copy the name, and I can click on the node group and press Ctrl V to paste that. So there is our mossy dirt material, and I can also drag the material output over here. So we can now add all of the different custom values. So I will select the mossy dirt and press the tab key to go into the node group. So right over here we have a group input, and we're going to put all the values into the group input, and then we'll be able to see them on the node. So I'm going to bring the group input down here, and the first thing that I want to do is put the mapping scale into the group input. And this way we can use the scale to scale all the textures, because the mapping node is going into all of the different textures, so it will control the scale for the entire material. Now if I press the N key to open up the side panel, I want to click right over here on groups, and there's some different options here. So right here on the inputs, I want to click on this scale, and I actually want to change the type from vector to float, because if I press the tab key to go out of the group, you can see we have X, Y, and Z values, but I just want this to be one slider. So if I tab to go back into the group, I can click on the vector, and I can change this to float, and this way it'll use one scale value. So I can tab to go back out of the node group, and then I just need to turn the scale back to 1 so it is using the default scale. So I can tab to go back into the node group. So the next custom value that I want to add is the moss scale. So I can take the noise texture from the moss and I can put the scale into the group input. And then right up here, if you press the N key to open up the side panel, I can double click on this to rename this. And I'm going to rename this to moss scale. And then I also want to add the dirt scale, so I can go right down here to the Musgrave, and I can take the Musgrave scale and I can put that into the group input, and then I can double click on this to rename this, and I can rename it to dirt scale. So now if I press tab to go out of the node group, we have the scale, which will control the entire scale, and then we just have the moss scale, and we just have the dirt scale. So I can tab to go back into the node group. Now I also want to add the dirt color and the moss color. So first let's go right up here to the moss, and I'm going to take the base color from the principled shader and I'm going to drag down and put that here. And then I'm also going to go right over here to the dirt, and we could put in both of these values. So you could put in A and B if you want to, but I'm just going to use B because B is lighter and it's easier to see. So I'm just going to be putting in B. So I'm going to click and drag here on B, and I can drag this over and I'm going to stick it here into the group input. And then I can rename these. So this one here, if I double click on this to rename this one is the moss color, and this one right here, I'm going to rename this one to dirt color. So if I tab to go out of the node group, we have moss and dirt colors. Let's go back into the node group. Now I also want to control the amount of moss that you can see. And this color ramp right here and this noise texture, those nodes are going into the factor, and so they're controlling how much moss there is and how much dirt there is. Now we don't really have any value here from the color ramp that we can plug into the input, so instead I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the hue saturation value node. And let's put this after the color ramp. So we can now change the value, and the value is going to make the color ramp colors lighter or darker. So you can see if I turn it down, there's lots of moss, or if I turn it up, there is very little moss. So I can take the value, I can drag this over, and I can stick it here into the group input. And then if I click here, I can drag this down to see more of the values, and then I can click on this to rename this, and I'm going to rename this to moss amount. Now I also want to be able to control the roughness, so what I can actually do is just take both roughness values, and I'm going to drag this over, and I'm going to stick this here into the group input, and then also right over here on the dirt, this roughness value, I can drag this over, and I'm going to stick that one into the same roughness. So you can actually put two wires into the same value, and because both roughness values are going into the same roughness input, this roughness value is going to control the roughness for the dirt and the moss at the same time. And then I also want to control the bump strength. So right here on the moss, we have this bump, and you could put in both of these if you want to, but I'm just going to use the first one because it is much stronger. So I can take the strength, and let's drag this down, and I'm going to put that here into the group input, and then I can rename this. I'm going to rename this to moss bump strength. And then I can do the same thing for the dirt. So I'm going to take the bump strength, let's drag this over, and I can put this here into the group input, and then I can rename this one to dirt bump strength. And then the last value that I want to add is the displacement strength. So on the displacement, we can take the scale, I can drag this over, and I'm going to stick it here into the group input, and then right here I can click on this to rename this, and I'm just going to rename this to displacement strength. So I can press the tab key to go out of the node group, and we now have all the custom values. I can also press the N key to close the side panel. So we have the scale to change the entire scale, then we just have the moss scale and just the dirt scale. We also have the moss color, so if you want to make this like a bit brighter and make it a bit more yellow, it kind of now looks like a dried out dead moss, or you could make it more of like a saturated green color if you want the moss to look more fresh. And you can also change the dirt color. Then there's also the amount of moss, so I can make very little moss or lots of moss. And then there's also the moss bump strength, the dirt bump strength, and then finally the displacement strength to make that much stronger. And also if I drag out the side panel here, I can go right here to the modifier properties, and I can click right here to display the modifier in the viewport. And so now we can see the dirt material with all of the detail. So there is the procedural mossy dirt material. So I'll just give this a final render. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to help support this channel, you can purchase this material on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, links in the description. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase more materials. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube to learn how to create all of my procedural materials. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching.